So, as with many, my family has been impacted by families of loved ones who have had a cancer diagnosis. And so it really has been an honor to work with patients as a GI medical oncologist in order to really, do this impactful work specific to liver cancer. I do think it's really an honor to learn from cancer patients, and I do that both in my basic science research laboratory here at the University of Wisconsin Center for Human Genomics and Precision Medicine, but also in the clinical environment through clinical trials. I think that there's potentially misconceptions about healthcare and how clinical trials work. And so kind of taking a step back from what I often do, which is study research in the laboratory and develop new clinical trials. I wanted to provide an overview about the practicalities of clinical trials for patients. The goal of this talk is to increase awareness around clinical trial opportunities, as well as the resources for patients and families affected by liver cancer. As a medical oncologist, I do have support. I receive small molecules that I screen in the research laboratory from Bristol Myers Squibb, from Boehringer Ingelheim. I also work with Boehringer Ingelheim as a consultant, and I have multiple clinical trials here at the University of Wisconsin and the William S. Middleton VA. So our agenda for today is to summarize the importance, time considerations, the phases, and all the eligibility that are required for clinical trials. I'd like to review, any patient questions, the risks, the benefits, and the costs around clinical trials, as well as explore barriers, resources, education, and opportunities for clinical trial involvement. This is really framed through the University of Wisconsin's experience, and obviously there are different resources in regions. And our hope with today is to provide this as a representative example, but also knowing that this network is integral to making sure that those resources are available for patients and their families, and navigating this space of clinical trials. So to start with, what are clinical trials? So cancer clinical trials are research studies in people that investigate ways to better prevent, diagnose, or treat cancer. Why are clinical trials important? They explore new ways to prevent, detect, and treat disease. They also can evaluate interventions. So chemotherapy is a medical intervention. There are other surgical or procedural interventions, and there's also behavioral interventions that can be used for patients. And ultimately, clinical trials contribute to our medical knowledge so that we can better treat cancer patients. When a clinical trial is open at my site and a patient decides to participate, I consider that such a privilege because one, there's an opportunity that individual may benefit from that therapy, but also if that therapy goes on to be approved, that really opens the door for other patients with that same cancer type. I think oftentimes patients feel like this is in isolation, and I think that considering a clinical trial opens the door to potentially help that individual, but also to contribute new knowledge. And some of the trials that have led to FDA approval that we participated in here at the University of Wisconsin, like Clarity as a representative example, for IDH mutant cholangiocarcinoma, what an impact that has, so that particular therapy or whatever intervention is available. We also participated in the histotripsy trials that led to FDA approval here within the last week and a half. And so, we strongly believe in clinical trials, but we believe that they have to be done in a way so that patients have that autonomy and patients are empowered to consider the trial. So clinical trials versus clinical research. So if you think about kind of the breadth of clinical practice, within clinical practice, there's a portion of clinical research. There are interventional trials. So that would be essentially any change that would be away from standard practice in any way. But then within that subset, there's also treatment trials or therapeutic clinical trials. Sometimes people use the term clinical research and clinical trials synonymously. This diagram kind of better demonstrates the relationship. Most of the time when we're talking about clinical research in cancer, we're talking about clinical trials, which is kind of the smallest circle here. But as I mentioned, cancer treatment clinical trials are research studies in people that investigate new treatment options for cancer, new treatments aimed at fighting cancer. However, clinical research is much more broad. For example, there were some discussions during the prior session about interventions for liver fibrosis. Today, as a GI medical oncologist, I'm really framing this around cancer clinical trials, but there's lots of clinical research that extends beyond what we do with say, therapies in oncology, specifically in preventing, say, the development of cirrhosis or the risk factors that lead to liver cancer. Where does precision oncology fit into this? So if you want to kind of zoom in on clinical research for these treatment or therapeutic clinical trials, precision oncology is meant specifically where there's a match. So this is a diagram that describes some of the biomarkers that are identified in intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma. Oftentimes, patients have one or, sometimes multiple, but oftentimes, one particular target that we know leads to the growth and proliferation of a cancer. This is more common in cholangiocarcinoma based upon our current knowledge, but our hope is that this could be applied more broadly in the future as we develop new biomarkers predictive of improved efficacy. But precision oncology treatment trials, or what we call sometimes basket trials, are when we identify a target like FGFR2 or IDH1, we essentially provide a therapy that is tailored or personalized to this. This is a big part of the cancer moonshot and will remain a very important part of the design and implementation of trials, and oftentimes requires us to take a step back and say, hey, how can we match you with the best precision target? This right now is a standard of care for cholangiocarcinoma, although there are emerging biomarkers in hepatocellular carcinoma where we can consider other precision-based strategies. So what is the best time to consider a clinical trial? The earlier, the better. There are clinical trials at any stage of treatment. The sooner you consider clinical trials, the more treatment options a patient may have. It's a myth that clinical trials are a last resort. They can be for a patient's first cancer treatment. They can be pre or post-surgery, really at any stage of disease. When considering a clinical trial, it's important to know that bullet number 2. So in bullet number 2, that clinical trials have different phases and they have different eligibility. I like to tell my patients that oftentimes there's about 45 boxes that I need to check to make sure that a patient is safe and appropriate for a clinical trial. That's an important part of the due diligence that we do in considering any patient. And oftentimes, if we don't have a clinical trial, it's important to ask the question, well, are there clinical trials in the region or are there clinical trials nationally? And I think that's a big part of this integrated network, is to make sure that if we don't have a trial for a particular patient's case, is there a better trial in the local region or nationally that could be considered? What are the different phases of clinical trials? So I am the lead for precision oncology and small molecule development for our phase 1 clinical trial group. These trials are looking at safety. So they're looking to see what is the dose and what are the side effects when we use doses for the first time often in patients. So these are phase 1 clinical trials that oftentimes have about 30 participants in order to get that signal of activity and potentially increase the dose to the point where we understand a little bit about, is a dose that we see active, say, in animal models, is that a dose that we can achieve in patients? Phase 2 clinical trials are really looking to see, is the treatment effective for a given cancer type? These often have less than 100 participants, but they're the first study to say, okay, we know this treatment is generally tolerable. Can we apply it at a broader scale for patients to see, does this have activity for a given cancer type? So these trials are really high priorities because they oftentimes are the first integration of innovative science, and they also have the check-in of we have safety for this treatment. And so these are oftentimes prioritized, and there have been in different circumstances where this has led to FDA approval, specifically in rare cancer types or rare molecular subtypes of cancer. Phase 3 clinical trials typically involve hundreds to several thousand participants sometimes, and they're used to define standard of care treatments, and oftentimes are direct comparisons to what the standard of care is. So you're taking the standard of care and trying to make that next step to improve therapy. For example, the recent I Am Brave clinical trial for advanced hepatocellular carcinoma compared an immunotherapy combination, atezolizumab with bevacizumab, to sorafenib, which was the current standard of care at that particular time. And so those trial designs are meant to change practice broadly if they're found to be positive. And lastly, there's phase 4 clinical trials that are after FDA approval, and they're essentially looking at the effects of the drugs across time. In order to be eligible for a clinical trial, there's certain enrollment criteria that have to be met. This is important for patient safety. Patient safety is one of our primary priorities, and has to be met in order for us to consider a patient for a clinical trial. This is particularly important when we think about liver function testing. So with advanced liver cancer, there oftentimes are changes in the indices of how the liver is working, the ability to make protein. And sometimes that can be a barrier to the safe implementation of clinical trials. There are clinical trials that are saying we have an effective treatment with this degree of liver function. Could we consider it with, say, a category B liver function? And we think those trials are extremely important to enroll to in order to provide the best safety data so that we can help inform all of our patients. So really, there's a distinct population of patients that are considered for the trial, and there's ongoing work to make sure that eligibility requirements are less restrictive. I think that specifically as it relates to liver cancer, we want to make sure that, one, we're meeting endpoints of safety, but two, that we're learning as much as we can if we feel that those safety parameters are met. Common eligibility criteria can include things like the diagnosis. So under the microscope, what does that look like? And that also can be the molecular diagnosis. What are the molecular growth factors that are particular to this given cancer? Oftentimes, there's certain stages of disease. So either metastatic disease or localized disease or resected disease. Also, it requires a good documentation of prior treatments, the numbers of treatments that patients have been on, as well as other medical diagnoses, recent hospitalizations, active infections. All of those things are looked at very closely, in addition to laboratory values in recent scans. There are some common questions about clinical trials. We like to talk to patients to share information about clinical trials, and there are some common misconceptions that I want to clarify. So one common one is, I need treatment. Will I get a placebo? So placebos are rarely used in cancer treatment trials. They can be used when there's no current standard treatment, which thankfully is not the case for many liver cancer types, or when a treatment compares to the standard treatment. So if you're taking a standard treatment and combining it with a new treatment, sometimes there's a placebo control in that design in order to provide a better understanding for the activity of this new treatment. What are the risks and benefits of participating in a trial? So oftentimes a clear benefit is access to new treatments that are not available outside of the trial. Um, Additionally, there is a very significant monitoring involved. So at the Carbone Cancer Center, you're often paired up with a member of the research team, and you can have kind of a direct phone call with that research team member in order to report any new symptoms or any changes while you're on that clinical trial. I would say that it probably doesn't change too much about the access to physicians. In general, there's, at least at our cancer center, there's 24-hour phone coverage to make sure that there's access to the individual oncologist or the physician in care. Clinical trial participation does provide an opportunity to give back to scientific knowledge and help future patients with this cancer. But there are risks. Patients are required to have sometimes extra visits, there's screening visits, and that can be time consuming. It can take away from work time, or it can add additional expenses such with transit. Sometimes there are some small financial payments that are made in order to offset, say, travel costs as an example. The new treatments may or may not be better. There's no way of predicting the future in clinical trials. And so there's the potential of having unexpected side effects from these new treatments. And there's no clear data across the correct number to say whether or not this new treatment is better. And that's the uncertainty and the rationale for doing the trials in many instances. If I join a clinical trial, do I have to finish it? Participating in a clinical trial is always optional. From my perspective as a medical oncologist, if I feel that the risks outweigh the benefits, I reserve the right to withhold treatment. That's true of our standard treatments, and that's also true of a clinical trial. But as a patient, if you have side effects, and those side effects can be directly related to the medicine, they can be directly related to time or things outside of the clinic, you always reserve the right to withdraw from a clinical trial, no questions asked. How are clinical trials paid for? So there's kind of two sides that clinical trials are paid for. The first is the research cost. So oftentimes there's some sponsor that steps up and says, I will pay for this medicine. That could be from a pharmaceutical partner. That could be from the National Cancer Institute. And those can include the study drug or additional lab monitoring. So lab tests or additional imaging or heart monitoring, all those things are defined as research costs and paid by the study sponsor, whether that's the National Cancer Institute or a pharmaceutical partner. But there are patient costs. So standard management, like standard CAT scans to evaluate that, is something that is supported by an individual's health insurance, but that is something that is not always covered. For example, with Medicare, there's a certain portion that's covered, but there can be additional expenses as there is with cancer treatment. Are clinical trials safe, and who will monitor my safety? So patients are given time for informed consent before deciding to participate and learn about side effects. So there's a formal consent process about the benefits and risks of treatment. Additionally, the study is monitored by the research team, the physician that you're seeing, as well as all the physicians within a given working group, the trial sponsor, and then there's a data and safety monitoring board. So if there is a side effect that is immediately reported, for example, if a patient is hospitalized, that has to be reported within 24 hours of that initial hospitalization in order to meet the standards that are required per the study. Clinical trials are also reviewed by the Institutional Review Board, and they have to abide by legal and ethical rules for medical practice. So here at the Carbone Cancer Center, we have over 250 trials for patients with different cancer types. We're always looking at ways to prevent, diagnose, or treat cancer better, and we have additional trials that are looking at quality of life for patients with cancer. It's important to consider the barriers to clinical trials. and those can include travel, time off, childcare, lodging. Those are probably the ones that we see the most from the patients that we treat. It's also important on the team science side to make sure that a model for clinical trial enrollment really has kind of many stop signs that we have to cross. So first off, is the trial available? A big part of our work is to evaluate kind of the landscape of trials and to make sure that we can offer them to patients. We try to align trials at different lines of therapy so that we can provide treatment for advanced disease, maybe in the first or the second line of therapy, but also have a robust first-in-human clinical trial program to consider later lines of treatment. We also work closely with interventional partners, like the histotripsy example. So if someone has localized disease and there's a new treatment option, we can consider those as well. We want to evaluate to see, is a patient eligible? So if we don't think about the trial or we don't have a trial available, we can't then say, well, is this individual eligible? But it's possible that a patient could be ineligible. For example, if someone had recent GI bleeding, that's a common example where, unfortunately, we cannot safely offer many of our study medications. We have to talk about trials. So if we don't bring it up at the time of our initial visit or at the time that new trials become available, we're not going to put patients on trial. We have to offer that to our patients. And most importantly, patients have to agree to participate. And so, that comes essentially from an understanding and having clear and transparent communication with patients in order to provide that opportunity to patients and also to the scientific and research community. The goals for our clinical trials is that we can offer a trial to every patient and that we can increase trial access and participation both within our individual cancer center and within the state of Wisconsin as part of the Wisconsin IDEA. We continue to strive to increase diversity in the participation of clinical trials, and we do that by having navigators that are intentionally working with our teams in order to make sure that if patients need additional support to be considered for a clinical trial, that they have that at our cancer center. And we do like to integrate research as part of our overall care model. Thank you so much for having me. Here's some resources. So we're at the Carbone Cancer Center. This is our Center for Precision Medicine. I think I'm sitting here in this office here today. Two resources that I think are very helpful include clinicaltrials.gov, which is a listing of all the trials here within the United States. And then the NCI through cancer.gov has a website here that includes a listing of liver cancer trials that are available here from the NCI. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kratz. We'll now turn it over to Dr. Jones-Pauly to moderate the Q&A.
All right. Good morning, Dr. Kratz. Thank you for your presentation. Our first question is biopsy involved in monitoring the treatment progress in a clinical trial? And what is the minimum span for seeing the progress? And the second part of the question is, if not biopsy, then what is the best method to monitor?
Yeah, so for interventional trials, it depends a little bit on the mechanism. So many of our phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials consider a on-treatment biopsy. And we think those are really important, especially for immunotherapy, because oftentimes there's an initial response, but there may be, say, a pathway of resistance or a change in the cancer that cannot be overcome with these interventional medications. And so sometimes biopsies are required. Oftentimes phase 3 clinical trials do not require a biopsy, but it really depends on the mechanism of a given agent and oftentimes the phase of the clinical trial. Sometimes earlier phase clinical trials, because they want to see, are we hitting the target, as an example, or are we killing cancer cells with early cancer regression? They oftentimes require an on-treatment biopsy. Many trials allow for enrollment with available tissue. And so in my practice for advanced disease, as is the practice in the UK, prior to treating with systemic therapy, we do think it's really important that we confirm under the microscope what that looks like, as well as look at the molecular underpinnings of these cancer types.
Awesome. And then the second part, if you are not using biopsy for whatever reason, what is the next best method?
So oftentimes there's non-invasive or blood tests that can be tumor markers, and we generally recommend them every 3 to 4 weeks for a patient who's on a clinical trial. And most clinical trials require CAT scans every 2 to 3 months. If patients cannot get a CAT scan for a particular reason, sometimes MRI is used, particularly because it is more sensitive. So either CAT scan or MRI is done every few months to evaluate the response for our interventional cancer therapeutic trials.
All right. The next question is, do you get paid to participate? And if so, is the fee the same for each one?
The fee is different. The fee amount depends a little bit on the requirements for the study, but that also is reviewed by a given institution's institutional review board. So the amount of funding available to some degree also depends upon the requirement. I know trials that provide around $100 for travel as a representative example for treatment visits. But I think that the intention of the trial is not to entice patients or to overtly kind of sway their judgment on that. It is to offset some of that cost involved with the practicalities of, gosh, I got to drive over to Madison to get my treatment.
Got it. The next question is, once the trial is done and FDA approval process is underway, do patients in the trial, including, I think maybe they mean current therapy rather than placebo, or if a rare placebo trial, do patients in the trial have access to the therapy while under review for FDA approval?
So that depends a little bit on the trial design. So the key word there is crossover. So if there's a trial that provides crossover, it allows for patients to go on and receive that therapy. Probably the best example in liver cancer recently has been the Clarity clinical trial that did allow crossover. So when you signed on the dotted line and said, I'm going to enroll in this trial, 2 patients received this ivosidenib treatment and 1 patient received a placebo at that ratio of 2 to 1. However, when the trial was ongoing and the progression-free survival was met, or if a patient progressed, they had the ability to cross over. And so when that trial was analyzed, there was a huge difference in the progression-free survival between the patients who started on ivosidenib. They did better than the patients who started on the placebo. However, all the patients who started on the placebo were also offered the chance to go on ivosidenib. And so when that kind of caught up, the difference in overall survival was actually more modest. And so in the design of the trial, they wanted to see how long could we control the cancer with an endpoint of progression-free survival. And thankfully, the difference in progression-free survival was large, and they can make that conclusion and get patients crossed over to receive the experimental treatment. That's probably the most sentinel example of that crossover. But asking, is crossover a possibility? It generally is more common, I believe, in pill-based treatment options. Or in trials that include placebo controls. That's a really great question, and one that you should ask as part of the trial enrollment.
Absolutely. Question 4, can you participate in multiple trials at the same time?
So it depends a little bit. You cannot participate in multiple therapeutic trials generally. You also have to oftentimes discontinue, treatments that may have an anti-cancer effect. So there's some turkey tom that that is is marketed, against cancer, oftentimes patients have to stop supplements that may have some anti-cancer treatment as well. So you cannot do that because it doesn't provide a fair view of treatment in order to make conclusions about a given study. So oftentimes you may have to stop, say, other naturopathic or homeopathic treatments, which is a larger discussion that that is outside of our discussion today. But sometimes you can be on two trials at the same time. If one of them is, say, an intervention that is directed at something like symptomatic support. So, for example, maybe there's a trial that is evaluating the toxicity of treatments or long-term survivorship or biomarker work. As a representative example, I have many patients who donate tissue and participate in clinical research where we grow living models of hepatocellular and cholangiocarcinoma in our research lab. And they also can enroll in clinical trials at the same time, so they can participate in multiple research. But for the therapeutic interventions, oftentimes it's limited to a single or a combination of agents.
It makes sense when you think about it, right? If you're on two different treatments, it's hard to tell which is having which positive effect or possibly even side effect, right? The trial on this.
And that's really important when we want to talk about toxicity, specifically for phase 1 clinical trials. And that's another reason to be very transparent with your patients about the medicines that you're taking. There was a lot of complicated information around the time of COVID, and patients were taking lots of different medicines. And that's really important if we're trying to protect the liver. The liver is such an important organ. If there's a therapy that could be toxic to the liver, it's really important that your healthcare provider knows those things, particularly when we're up against liver cancer.
Right. And the final question is, are there clinical trials that you have seen with great outcomes for liver cancer? Anything promising on the horizon?
Yeah, so I think there's always excitement, in liver cancer. I think that ways of using combinations for immunotherapy are really important in a pathway forward as a field. I won't name any particular clinical trials because, gosh, I'm biased by the trials that we bring to our institution, but I think the opportunities to do cellular therapies or immune-based therapies, and also to combine them with local regional management together, I think those are pathways forward. I think that we have to work together as multidisciplinary teams. Just last night, one of our interventional radiology colleagues reached out and said, "Hey, histotripsy is now, FDA designated, right? So how do we take the latest technologies and integrate them, with immunotherapy?" I'm really excited about that because as a medical oncologist, I'm also focused on targeted treatments. And so, I think that combination therapies are a pathway forward. And I also think that we can learn a lot from the brave patients who have participated in recent trials. As a representative example, the I'm Brave 150 trial included a correlative paper that was published in a Nature subset journal. And it looked at how the molecular subtypes had different outcomes for advanced liver cancer. And so those types of papers, aren't the clinical trial papers that change our practice, but gosh, we can learn a lot from them and use them in integrating future trial designs.
Absolutely. Well, I think that concludes our Q&A for this session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. And I really appreciate the time here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kratz. That was very informative information. I can't wait to share that information with our larger audience.